Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for a lively policy debate on the expansion of the child tax credit and other policies and proposals to support low and moderate income families. We are delighted to have you here today and delighted to be joined by our partners, the American Academy of Political and Social Science, and as well as generous support from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to bring you this conversation today. A quick word about Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization founded during the 2008 presidential cycle to do three main things. One, to bring a clearinghouse for poverty news and information and aggregates all of that for you in one place. We drive content through creation of commentaries, journalism, and videos, and then try to do what we're doing today, which is play the role of convener on important policy debates around poverty and opportunity. So we're so glad you could be here today. We're especially glad to be talking about this issue, which has been one that we've followed for at least 20 years because of the bipartisan support that tax credits and tax relief for working families has enjoyed. And we are very excited to dig into this policy, get into the weeds a little bit, and the legislative state of play today. And if there was ever a group of panelists that could make tax policy exciting, we've got them here for you today. So really excited to dive into this conversation. For those of you who are on social media, we are tweeting live today's event, so please feel free to join the conversation on Twitter. We'll be using these hashtags listed here on the screen and encourage you to tweet and follow our handles. So we have a great lineup of speakers for you today. First, Avenel Joseph, the Vice President for Policy at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, will offer some early framing remarks to kick us off, which will be wonderful. And then next, we will dive into the key policy issues with our esteemed panel, all of them listed here today. Our moderator will be Aparna Mathur, who is a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, Masar Rahmani Center for Business and Government. And then our panelists today will have Tom West, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Domestic Business Tax, joining us. We'll also have, at the U.S. Department of Treasury, we'll also have Sam Hammond, the Director of Poverty and Welfare Policy at the Niskanen Center, Chai-Ching Huang, the Executive Director at the Tax Law Center at NYU, and Wells King, the Research Director at American Compass. And lastly, after we have this panel conversation, we are going to have a lively and plenty of time for Q&A. So please look at the Q&A box. You can start putting those questions in for the panelists as we're talking, and we'll have plenty of time to get to as many of those questions as we can. And with that, I'd like to turn the mic over to Avenel Joseph of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to kick us off. And again, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Shelley. I'm so pleased and gratified to be supporting the second webinar sponsored by Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity and the American Academy of Political and Social Science to provide a nonpartisan exploration of the crucial topic of reducing child poverty through the expansion of refundable tax credits, including the child tax credit. In today's world, there are far too few occasions when we can convene a bipartisan and broadly trans-ideological panel of DC policy experts from leading think tanks, left, right, and center, and find that their analysis and recommendations converge with clear agreement on the need to invest critical resources to reduce child poverty and support families across the income spectrum. There have been decades of leadership, from Newt Gingrich and President Trump to Presidents Clinton and Obama, who've advanced tax credit approaches to support families struggling to raise healthy children. To be sure, there are important details about how best to expand and extend the child tax credit that our panelists will debate today. But as a foundation devoted to ensuring everyone, including children, have a fair and just opportunity to live their healthiest lives, we at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation are thrilled that what our panelists will share today reflect far more areas of agreement than disagreement. and that the debates are not about whether to support families raising children, but how. Through an expansion passed in the American Rescue Plan, tens of millions of American families have just received their first payments of an expanded monthly tax credit in their bank accounts and mailboxes. This largely happened automatically, without having to stand in long lines, deal with long phone waits, or with any burdensome bureaucracy. Indeed, some 97% of families have received their tax relief in this way. That's a remarkable accomplishment for any social or tax policy. And these checks will have tremendous impacts. There'll be more money for families with low incomes as we struggle to come out of the pandemic and economic crisis it created for so many families. Over 90% of all families with children will receive an average annual benefit of $4,380. There'll be lower rates of poverty in 2021 because of this policy. The advanced portion of this child tax credit alone, delivered over the next 6 months, is expected to reduce the share of children in poverty from 13.7% to 11.3% in 2021. The expanded child tax credit will reduce racial and ethnic and economic disparities that have persisted in this country for far too long. Black and Latino Americans are disproportionately affected by poverty and lack of economic opportunity due to structural racism, past and present discrimination. These new benefits will reduce some of the most egregious and persistent income disparities for families and children of color. And as Sam Hammond of our panel will explain, the expanded tax credits will also provide a major boost to the economies of hard-pressed communities and states across the nation. So the question our panelists will explore and debate today, based on their research, analysis, and years of expertise, is what can we do beyond next year? What we decide has the power to transform our nation. I'm so excited for this conversation today. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Shelley.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Avinal. Really appreciate those comments. And I'll ask the panelists to join on video and hand it over to our esteemed moderator, Aparna Mathur.
Thank you, Shelley, and thank you, Avinal, for that introduction. Just to add my own comments, as you both mentioned, the child tax credit has traditionally enjoyed bipartisan support as a means to help families struggling with childcare expenses and as a ladder to help families climb out of poverty. More recently, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act under President Trump expanded the CTC, and now the Biden administration is sending out monthly checks based on a further expansion of the CTC. The popularity of the CTC reflects an acknowledgement that costs of childcare have increased over time, and we need to be doing more for the 1 in 6 children who live in poverty in the United States. COVID-19 exposed these vulnerabilities even further, with many families reporting food scarcity and many parents losing their jobs, exacerbating existing inequalities. In this context, the temporary expansion of the CTC has been welcomed by many as a lifeline providing much needed relief. However, President Biden and the administration now propose to make the CTC expansion longer term and perhaps permanent, which leads to our debate and discussion today. What are the advantages and the pitfalls of the proposed expansion, and what other family supportive policies are missing from the debate thus far? We have an amazing panel to discuss these questions, and I'm going to get into this right away. So let's start off with a sort of a brief backgrounder question on the CTC. Why do we think it has had popular support? We've heard a lot of discussion about how Republicans and Democrats have tended to, propose expansions of the CTC. Do we agree that it has the potential to reduce child poverty, to help families in need?
Thanks so much, Shelley. And I think I would underscore just that sort of point about how much popular support and bipartisan support it has had over the decade since 1997 when it was first enacted. I think it's pretty remarkable to reflect on the fact that it has been expanded 11 different times, expanded or extended, sometimes on a bipartisan basis, sometimes, such as in the 2017 tax law, by Republicans alone, sometimes by Democrats alone. And I think one of the things that sort of momentum towards both increasing the child tax credit and particularly including more of the lowest income families in that support has coincided with, over those decades, the research support for the benefits of such cash and near cash transfers, really sort of remarkably starting to put together the story that I know that you talked about on your previous webinar, but really just sort of showing how across the life cycle of children and families receiving these supports, how much it does for reducing instances of low birth weight and improving health outcomes during childhood, improving education outcomes, and ultimately higher earnings. So I think some of the public popularity is around just seeing that, helping make ends meet in practice does flow through to those benefits for children. But also, I think some of that political support has come from this really sort of growing and very robust body of research that is pointing to the long-term benefits, not only for families and households, but for broader communities, the economy, the budget over the long term.
Mm-hmm. Sam, do you want to go next?
Did you say Sam? Yeah, I would second Avenel's opening remarks about this being not just bipartisan, but transpartisan. And by that, I mean, this isn't just a split the difference policy. As Avenel said, this will have huge anti-poverty effects, also advancing racial justice and racial equity. That's if you're coming at it from a progressive perspective. But at the same time, many conservatives, myself included, are attracted to this policy because it supports family stability. It will, when you look at child benefits abroad, they're very effective at reducing rates of abortion and really extending that sort of pro-life message to the entire life. And so I think this is one of the big reasons why you've seen this convergence. Conservatives in general are relatively skeptical of bureaucracy, and we want to empower parents to use resources flexibly and sort of guide their own vision of the good life. And that's what the child tax credit does. When we're looking at alternative proposals, I think it's notable that even some of the bigger critics of the recent expansion, like Senator Rubio and Mike Lee, they have a proposal for the child tax credit, which, while it has a phase-in, is even larger than the existing expansion. So there seems to be, debate around the margins, but to the point of whether we need to support families and children in particular, there's really no debate at this point.
Mm-hmm. Well done, Tom.
I would love to echo some of Sam's points there about sort of why the right of center and conservatives in particular are, I think, there's really beginning to see a consensus emerge about particularly cash support for families. Of course, we will see a lot of both sort of the pronatal and family stability effects that I think a lot of social conservatives rightly want to see. Mm-hmm. But more broadly, it is a statement of value. Conservatives, I think, have rightly, stressed and emphasized the importance of family, and now they're wanting to do so and using the fiscal power of the federal government to do so. And of course, it's widely popular. We did a survey here at American Compass at the start of the year, where we surveyed 2,000 parenting age Americans, age 18 to 50. And what we found was, regardless of class or political ideology, parental or marital status, anywhere from 60 to 75% of Americans think that the government should support families. Their reasons differ. Some it's child outcomes. For others, it's really just a statement of values. For others, it's just that families need financial support. But there really is a political consensus emerging on the right of center about needing to do something. Making sure that we're able to use the tax code or some other form of a benefit to support families. There is some disagreement within the right of center. I imagine we will get to that later. But where we do see a consensus is that there should be support, and often that the support should be simple, it should be flexible, and ideally it should be cash.
Mm-hmm. Tom?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to what my co-panelists have said. I mean, I'd echo many of those things. I think in this year in particular, as we've worked on implementation, within Treasury and IRS of the current 2021 advanceable child tax credit. We spent a lot of time looking at the recipients and how to find recipients. And one thing that we found that when you dig into the data, as others have said here, these are working families who need support. And the advanceability, and in particular, the refundability that was put in place for 2021, I think is proving critical. And again, I think there's broad consensus that supporting working families, even lower income working families, is something that we should all be behind.
Great. So we'll get into the administrative issues in a little bit. I want to get each of your thoughts on the current proposed expansion of the CTC. So, how it was designed for just this year, not the permanent expansion that might be coming. But really, the way it is working out, the advance credit, the monthly payments, are there ways that it could have been designed differently? Is the proposed expansion or the actual expansion, well done? Is it actually helping families? Do we have any data on how what's working, what's not? Any thoughts on the current policy and, whether we could have done better? Is it too much, too little? Wells, do you want to go first on that?
Sure. Just from a design standpoint, I happen to think the benefit went a little too far. In part, it was the design. This should be at least relief for working families. I know the White House in their page where they describe the benefit, they use the term 7 times, and it's always framed as support for working families. But it's also going to those who don't work, to non-tax filers. And I think a lot of the popularity that you've seen at the CTC in past years is that it's gone to those who pay taxes and those who work. These are the common complaints from the right of center. You can't see a split where some say it really just should not exceed tax liability. There's others who just say you should reinforce work. But I think there are a lot of questions that need to be raised about this being a reciprocal form of a benefit, where there is an expectation of work in supporting a family. And my personal view is that we should be thinking about these types of benefits as a kind of social insurance for working families, and that for families that don't work and don't pay taxes, that we have to have a different approach. We've seen that in welfare reform and through temporary assistance for needy families as being, I think, a great policy achievement for assisting those families. We need more, we need to improve it, but for the purposes of a child tax credit, a family benefit, I think it should be for working families.
Yeah, I think we're probably going to get into this work question quite a bit later, and I would love to respond directly to some of those concerns. But before we do, I think it would be important to just sort of reflect on what the expansion does do. It will lift 40%. It will reduce child poverty rates by 40% in the years in which it's in effect. It's going to reduce deep poverty, those below half the poverty line, by 1.1 million children per year, roughly. And those are really important gains that should be made permanent. I think, in particular, sort of skipping ahead to some of the work questions, it's really important to think about the children and the families who are receiving those supports. And again, the research shows that those sorts of investments in children and those families can have really long run, pretty remarkable impacts, including on work effort in the second generation. So, I think both for alleviating immediate hardship and for investment in the economy and some of the things that are concerns underlying this work targeting issue, this thing should be made permanent. It would also bring us much more in line with comparative rich nations that also, if you look at the sort of cross-country data, there's not really much evidence of impacts on labour force participation or other kind of negative outcomes that folks might be concerned with.
Just to build on those comments, I mean, just this year, there's a new analysis of the Canada Child Benefit, which is fully refundable just like this, but also significantly larger. And they determined zero impact on either the intensive or extensive margin of labor force participation. But to Wells' point, I think there's also a deeper normative point here about the reciprocity in these benefits. And I also see the child tax credit and child allowances as a kind of social insurance. And actually, being fully refundable is why it is a kind of social insurance. Income volatility is a real thing, and people go through temporary spells of non-work, either because in many cases for the child credit, because they had a baby, right? And it's disturbing when you look at the reasons people enter traditional welfare programs like TANF. High on the list is a child is born. And in that sense, those programs end up becoming sort of maternity leave programs of last resort. And one of the hopeful things I have with the child allowance is it sort of brings and pools everybody together into one common system where we don't have highly targeted means tested programs for people who go through those temporary work disruptions. Because if you look at a program like SNAP, you can look at folks who are on it chronically, or you can look at the average duration. And the typical SNAP recipient is only in the program for about 9 months. So people have these shocks to their work. Maybe they'd have to take a temporary leave to care for a family member or such. And when you have this phase in, it doesn't, on the upside, maybe you can argue it promotes work, but on the downside, when your income falls, you're also then losing part of your credit. So that can end up amplifying the shock to your income, which is sort of the inverse of social insurance. So I think the refundability and the periodic payment is what brings stability, and it's sort of this platform, this foundation that will be there. And I think that's also why it's important to make this permanent and not just do sort of 1 or 2 year or 3 year extensions, because that completely obviates the stability point. Like, if you don't know for sure if next year or the year after you're still going to be receiving this, then the uncertainty just comes rushing back in.
The other benefit of that is a macroeconomic one. I mean, we've just had a sort of a really rather large reminder of shocks to the economy that are hard to sort of, although Congress has done very well to scramble and respond to. And one of the major responses was in the child tax credit full refundability provision. Having that in permanent law would mean that the next time that there is a recession, that families that are sort of experiencing those temporary shocks to their income will sort of know that there is going to be continuity of that benefit, and it would sort of automatically help stabilize the economy in a way that the child tax credit has been a little bit ambiguous about so far because of the way that it's designed to miss out those lowest income families. It would make it much more unambiguously countercyclical.
I agree with that. I think Chai-Ching mentioned, thinking about the children who this is going to, and I think, 26 million children who received payments in July would have received some kind of phase out, or would have been their family units would have been phased out prior to the rescue plan expansion. And those children, when you think about the children in those families, I mean, the outcomes for them being dictated by the fluctuations of parental or guardian income, doesn't seem like the right policy choice to me. Anyway.
Tom, if I can stick with you for a minute. So you started talking a little bit about the administrative hurdles that are being faced in getting payments actually to families who are really in need, either because they're not filing, they don't have a bank account, or they have never filed taxes. But there's also a targeting issue where some people are saying, well, I'm earning $400,000, married couple earning $400,000 are still getting the payment. Do you see any issues there? I know, you probably, I don't know if you're, allowed to comment on that, but there are issues on both ends. One, the money going to families who may not need it as much. And the second, the very real issue that families who do need it are probably not the first to get access to the money. So what can we be doing there? Can you talk a little bit about those administrative issues? And, you've all written about the need to fund the IRS better. How would that help with the current situation?
Sure. So I don't know that I want to speak to kind of what should be done at the phase out at the top end here. I think that's a discussion that Congress is in the midst of now in terms of, the prospective planning. But I absolutely agree that where we can and should be focusing on is at the lower end, and in particular the non-filers who we are, I think collectively all aware of, but we can't quite place a number, on those people. So, we are working to better understand what families and family units fall into those categories. I mean, by definition, these people are very hard to reach. The IRS and Treasury have worked very hard by pulling in people, in the last administration through the EIP payments, round 1 and 2. They had a non-filer portal, brought in 7 million people who hadn't been filing before or hadn't filed in the last 2 years. That was great. We've continued that to have a non-filer portal for CTC and for the third round of EIP payments too. It's available not just for folks who are coming in to register for the advanced child tax credit, but to your point, that I don't think that's enough. And I think trying to understand the hesitancy of people to come in and file. I mean, there are a certain number of people who live in the cash economy, and whatever benefits you offer them are not going to be worth it, or in their mind won't be worth it to come in. Those people I don't know how to get. There's people who think they're going to lose other benefits, either federal or state benefits. And although we've been messaging that that's not the case, I think we could do a better job spreading the word, because that is one thing I hear. People are very concerned about losing other benefits. Then there's a category of filers who, children who move between so many different households, or are in and out of households. They're on their own for parts of the year. I think it's really going to take a broad outreach effort that goes beyond what the IRS is capable of. Frankly, I think, in my experience, when the IRS says we're here to help, I think there's some reasonable skepticism. And even frankly, with the communities we're talking about, when the federal government comes and says we're here to help, there's an understandable skepticism. So it is going to take kind of finding trusted validators in communities. And that's a really hard, almost door-to-door effort. That's another reason we need this extended, because we need time to find those families and those kids, because I think if we can get them in the system, and what you're seeing after the July 15th payment, I hope, and it's been our hope, is that there was a lot more awareness. People were vaguely aware that this was happening, but I think you saw, the real uptick in social media awareness. We were talking before we got on here about TikTok videos, that kind of thing. And that makes that, we can laugh, but that makes a real difference in the average person in terms of getting through to them. So we're pushing, and the Treasury and the IRS and all of government is really put our awareness efforts behind this. But I think there's so much government can do, and then we got to find the right trusted partners to get the rest of the word out to these hard to find communities.
Makes sense. Well, Sam.
Yeah, I'll add two things to that. The IRS, their budget in inflation-adjusted terms has been flatlined for 30 years. And over that time, we've had tens of millions more tax returns to file, significant workforce cuts, something like 38% of IRS employees are now eligible for retirement. So there's a wave coming, and I think that this goes beyond, boosting the IRS to some new height. It's really just making up for past shortfalls. And I think as this program evolves, it will be important, to Tom's point, to separate tax enforcement from benefit administration. And whether that remains at the IRS or not, in past restructurings of organizations, like when Immigration National Services was restructured into DHS, one of the ideas behind that was, we can't have the same organization that's trying to attract immigrants also be enforcing immigration law, because that sends conflicting messages. And so I think, by analogy, the IRS needs to look forward to, its own sort of internal restructuring to make sure that these benefits are administered in a way that's cohesive and sort of firewalled off from, the men in black suits who people are afraid of.
Yeah, in terms of the administration, particularly to non-filers, I think there really are sort of two broader challenges here. One is just, I think, communicating the message itself that a tax credit is going to go to people that don't pay taxes is, I think, is really potentially politically divisive, and it's a difficult type of argument to make. That's the first point. And structuring the benefit and providing it, administering it through the IRS, I do think sends a kind of a mixed message on that front. I think ideally this type of benefit is administered through the Social Security Administration. They already administer more child benefits than any other federal agency. And to the extent that these benefits are meant to follow a child with a Social Security number, I think that they really do make the most sense. We here at American Compass, my colleague Orrin Cass and I have drafted our own proposal where we also suggest that these sorts of payments should be administered by Social Security. I think we would overcome a lot of these administrative hurdles were we to do so.
So I guess I would love to sort of add sort of three different on the hands on one hand, on the other on this. I mean, I think, to Sam's point, it's really incredible that an IRS that's had its budget cut that much and doesn't have enough staff to answer even 20% of the phone calls that it receives has managed to get out payments to 60 million kids in the space of a few months. That's a pretty remarkable thing to reflect on, given the way the agency's been cut. On the other, there has been some quite deserved criticism of the user interfaces of the various tools that have been stood up. And again, that's partly a completely resource-starved agency hooking up into legacy systems, free file providers, just sort of using whatever it has at hand in a very short period. But I think on the third hand, what we've seen in other countries and what we should see here, I hope, is that going forward, lawmakers need to provide resources and authorities and in fact require the IRS to deliver in terms of the interfaces and the outreach something much better and more robust to get to those non-filers. We don't get those poverty reductions that we cited earlier if we don't get to these people. And lawmakers have that opportunity in front of them to really sort of make that administration piece much more robust. On the SSA point, I would just note that in other countries, what we have seen is just a complete alphabet soup of who's delivering what. Sometimes it's the tax agency, sometimes it's the benefit agency, sometimes it's an integrated agency, sometimes it's two agencies combining forces. And to my mind, the lessons from that experience is that it doesn't really actually matter that much who's doing it, as long as you have the authorities and the resources in place to do it well. And what those countries have done is that they've often had pretty major growing pains getting into the system to start off with, and then have iterated and improved both those interfaces and the ways that different agencies, regardless of who has the lead, talk to each other and are able to do the outreach. And in fact, New Zealand, who's had a child tax benefit since 2004, and was even at that point regarded as sort of world leading in its IT systems, has just implemented another major IT restructure to further sort of deliver benefits in an even more timely and accurate way. So that's just going to be a continual process that we can expect after we have some of these initial teething problems. But again, I think that those lawmakers need to make sure that we are moving in that direction of improvement.
I think that's an interesting segue into sort of the next question about, it seems that there's broad consensus that the current CTC expansion has been beneficial to families. And yes, you could have targeted it more towards working families rather than everyone. I think the worry, and you can, flesh this out a little bit more. The thinking on the right is that, if we're moving away completely from making this a tax credit, first of all, because as you said, it's no longer connected to whether people actually file or not, whether they're working or not. Are we moving, what are we doing with this system? And if we make this permanent, are we then also moving away from the incentive the earlier CTC had to keep people employed, to keep people in the labor force? Like, what are the employment effects likely to be? What are the concerns that, you mentioned that people on the right have with a permanent expansion of the CTC, even if people on the right genuinely believe that the CTC is a good policy to help working families and to help children in poverty? What are the concerns with making the CTC permanent?
Well, the concerns around work really are multiple. It really depends on the person on the right of center with whom you're speaking. Some worry that parents may reduce their work hours slightly, and that is a fact that we should try to mitigate actively through policy. I don't share that view. I view reduction in work hours as being a feature and not a bug of this policy. And we should, in fact, be happy that parents are able to take additional financial resources to step away from the workforce, or at least to work less and spend more time with their children potentially. But in terms of, I think, moving just beyond the tax code and even potentially beyond a tax credit, where I hope the right of center moves is more towards thinking about this as a form of social insurance that's just a separate benefit, much more like Social Security. I would still like to see the right of center maintain the sort of normative position on reciprocity, that you work, you pay into the system, you give back to the society through productive work. And so maintaining as simple as possible a work requirement will, I think, be the consensus view on the right. Of course, the Rubio-Lee tax credit expansion does not just require work, but also limits the size of the benefit to your tax liability. But I would like to see the right of center move beyond that and really just sort of hold the line at work and reasserting that. So at American Compass, for instance, we've outlined a proposal called the Family Income Supplemental Credit, which is thinking about this as an income supplement, a form of reciprocal social insurance. And its novel feature is just a very simple, straightforward work requirement that your monthly payment cannot exceed 1/12 of your prior year's adjusted gross income for your household. It's simple, it's straightforward, and a single parent raising 2 kids working 30 hours a week in a minimum wage job will receive the full payment. It's a straightforward way of, I think, maintaining that, I think, straightforward, commonly shared normative position on reciprocity and work being valuable, while also being able to move away from, I think, the labyrinthine maze that is the tax code, and moving away as well from tax liability as being some kind of a limiting principle in the size of the benefit.
Yeah, I would second some of those remarks. As much as I kind of agree that it doesn't really matter which 3-letter agency this is done out of. I think the more important thing is that we move beyond sort of the tax gratification of everything. Because when we're talking about this as a monthly payment, really it's sort of an as-if monthly payment. It's an advance on an annual tax refund. Yeah. And when it comes to mid-year adjustments, babies born, tragic deaths, divorces, changing custody, people moving addresses mid-year, all those things are going to be much more difficult to administer in the context of an annual as-if monthly payment. Going to the reciprocity point, I think another sort of normative idea to social insurance is sort of the entitlements to citizenship, and that being, there's a reason why we don't spend Social Security just on foreign aid, right? that money could buy a lot of malaria bed nets, right? But there's a social compact that we have that this is part of a common pool of social insurance. And what really worries me is that since welfare reform, we've had this compact that long-term green card holders be here 5 years before you can access most benefit programs. I see some of that consensus starting to wither, and I worry that if this is not just made permanent but also extended without the Social Security number requirements, that not only will that sort of undermine some of the social compact nature of this, but also harm the program itself in the longer run by catalyzing a backlash.
So to that, I would sort of, just encourage a much broader view of the social compact here. I mean, I think no program standing by itself is, the encapsulation of the entire social compact. And back to one of your opening questions or remarks, Aparna, there are many other parts of both the social safety net and the package that's being considered at the moment, including a number of items that are very directly, much more explicitly in the work support space. And in fact, when you sort of look at the National Academies of Sciences assessment of a package that looks very much like the Biden package, with a large sort of something like a refundable child tax credit alongside boosts in the EITC, alongside paid family leave and childcare and other supports for being in the labor force, what you do see is not even thinking about the second generation, an immediate increase in labor force participation. So, I mean, I understand, Sam and Wells, that when you're sort of thinking about these things, you're thinking about it from a programmatic perspective in terms of what you can sell, and thinking about the political durability from that perspective. But in response to that consideration, I think it really is, to me, kind of an optimistic data point that what we do see over multiple decades of the CTC is this movement towards more refundability and more simplicity, even more simple than a prior year AGI rule, which would be, I would have to say, actually kind of tricky to implement, and moving in the direction of more really clearly having a family support be directed at being a family support and not trying to also do work requirements and the entirety of the social compact.
I feel like I'm just the tax functionary here. I'm not as deep as some of my colleagues in the background and all of the studies, but I know, like, across the OECD, they've had unconditional child benefits for years, and they've had higher labor force participation than we have. Chai-Ching was talking about Canada has a long experience with this, and all of the information and all of the studies point to no disincentive to work. I think the fact that the phase outs here are actually much higher than historically, I think, any argument about a disincentive to work less because you're going to phase out of benefits, I think the current design kind of addresses that. So, I'm interested to see where we go with this and where Congress goes. I programmatically, I understand what Wells and Sam are saying. I do, but I feel like we have some good anecdotal experience from around the world at this point that would tell us that there's a path forward here.
Great, and I bet we'll have a ton of studies coming out looking at the first year of the CDC expansion. Before we turn over to audience questions, I had just two more quick questions that I think I'm just going to open up to the panel, whoever wants to go first. One is, of course, about the budgetary cost of we know that the CTC is one, fraction of what is being proposed. We already had the American Rescue Plan, and now we have, we're proposing more than $3 trillion in spending, and there's a lot of concern about, what will that do to inflation? What does that do to our ability to sort of deal with future risks that might arise in the economy? So just, are you worried about that? Do you think this is critical to push through, especially at a time when we know that, most of us think the economy is out of the recession, we're well on the road to recovery, people are back in the workforce, is that critical to push through? And secondly, the panel is not, as Chai-Ching started talking about other policies, we've discussed the CTC a lot, but what are your preferred options for other policies that support families? What would you like to see the administration go for? What are your top priorities? So I'm just going to open it up. Sam, I'm seeing you smiling, so I'm going to let you go first.
Yeah, to the budgetary question, I don't think this is inflationary. However, there's never been a social policy change of this magnitude that was enacted purely through deficit financing. And I think it's really important that the child benefit in particular be paid for, especially as we discuss permanence. Because of course, putting my macroeconomist hat on, a temporary one-year credit is much less stimulative than inflationary than a permanent benefit indefinitely. When Canada expanded their child benefit in 2016, a year later, their central banker put out a statement saying that they had unexpected positive employment effects. They were moving to full employment faster than anticipated and would have to raise interest rates. So there is It is the case that families of children and low-income families living paycheck to paycheck have a much higher, marginal propensity to consume, to use some jargon. They're going to spend these benefits, and that money will circulate in the local economy. We're going to put out an analysis next Monday that shows the incremental spending that this will drive is approximately $27 billion. That's money that's going to flow into local communities. The impact in relative terms is going to be much larger for rural America. Just picking a state at random, the total value of the CTC for Idaho is roughly 1.8% of their state GDP. So just under $2 in every $100 spent in Idaho now will be a child credit. And that's money that's going to go back into local communities, local neighborhoods, local churches. And the thought experiment I like to do is, imagine if we abolish Social Security overnight. The rural economy in America would collapse. I don't think anyone would doubt that. This is putting that thought experiment in reverse. I think in relative terms, you're going to see a big boost in the vibrancy of non-metropolitan regions. When it comes to other policies that I'd be interested in seeing, I think there's a lot of momentum and a lot of perceived bipartisanship around paid family leave.
Mm-hmm.
But I think and you know all about this, Aparna, and you wrote the report on it. I think where that is hitting an impasse right now is that Democrats have a vision that's much more comprehensive, mm-hmm. and Republicans have a vision that's much more focused on parental paternity leave. Mm-hmm. And I think if we did a focus on maternity paternity leave, we'd have a much better chance at reaching a consensus. And I think it would pair well with the expansion of the child credit, because as you know, maternity paternity leave, don't just support families during the early years of their child's birth, but also maintain attachment to the labor force.
Mm-hmm. Right. Wells, Jaicheng?
Yes, I completely agree with Sam about funding for a child tax credit expansion. It needs to have a permanent, reliable source of funding. I think we should consolidate some of the other tax credits that are currently out there, for instance, the CDCTC, to go into and help to fund a child tax credit expansion. I think it's wise to leave those types of parenting decisions up to the parents, and using that to expand a child tax credit is, I think, a no-brainer. In terms of alternative policies, I tend to think here that cash is king. That a family benefit that's straightforward and flexible is the way to go, and really do think that the right of center will and should, I think, resist proposals to expand subsidies for childcare, where I think that there is a kind of a normative preference for two-earner households that doesn't actually reflect the preferences of most Americans, certainly couples with young children, and certainly lower and working class couples with young children, where at least our polling at Compass has shown a very clear preference for not only direct cash assistance as opposed to childcare, but also a preference for a full-time earner and a stay-at-home parent. I think beyond that, the two real focuses in terms of policy for supporting family is one, finding ways to cut the cost of housing through expanding the housing stock, and then finding ways as well to support wages and generate tremendous wage growth so that you can raise a family on a single income. I think that should be a priority of the Republican Party and the conservative movement going forward. I think we're beginning to see a small consensus there. So things like wage subsidies, pursuing tight labor markets, should and can be seen as a form of family policy that supports the type of Republican agenda that I would like to see, which is just that wherever you are, you can raise a family the way you see fit on a single income.
Mm-hmm.
I think on the budgetary question, it's important to note that some of these long-term effects that we're sort of seeing in the research do have second round budgetary impacts. There's a simulation drawing on a pretty comprehensive literature review of cash and near cash supports by Henron and Sprung Kaiser that suggests that these sorts of investments over the long run do flow through into reduced spending on income supports and also increased tax take from higher earnings over the long run that reduces or offsets the budgetary costs. Now, that sort of estimate's not precise enough or within the budget window enough to sort of become part of the official cost estimate or something that we sort of officially take into account in the scoring process. But it does give a reason to sort of think through if there were a case for sort of not paying for some or all of even a permanent type of policy. This is the sort of policy where the investment returns, even on a budgetary front, are among the clearest. But that's somewhat a theoretical question, because what we face right now is a reconciliation process where every dollar of permanent spending must be paid for. And I think we do have in front of us a number of really sound offsets on the tax in the tax space that would, close that fiscal issue and also help alleviate those inflationary concerns.
Tom,
I think my priorities are the administration's priorities as laid out in the families plan and the jobs plan. And I don't know that I'm allowed to have my own priorities, but I like some of Chai-Ching's.
Thank you. Yes, that makes sense. I think it's time we got the audience in. Turning over to Shelley. And I apologize for dropping off the internet right as I started with the first question. That's the bane of Zoom seminars, I believe. Thank you.
We're just glad you're back, Aparna, and we'll pull you into some of these questions as well. Yeah, so we have a few from the audience in the Q&A, and please put some more in since we do have time for questions. But one sort of follow-up that came actually via text to me was to your last point, Chai-Ching, about some of the offsets that we can expect to see and how this might create some added benefits. I know, Sam, you don't want to scoop yourself here, but any additional data you could provide, especially on some of the small business or, as we're coming back out in these 6 months, how this might have effects on some communities that are still struggling to recover, especially in the small business and low wage labor markets, which have not kind of jumped back as fast for some families. Did you any data you can highlight that might be coming from your study?
Yeah, so we applied I think kind of innovative approach to estimating job creation from the child tax credit, because we have seen that this is more than just a anti-poverty measure and a family stability measure. It's also money that flows right back into local communities. As I alluded to, the number that we extracted was $27 billion in an incremental increase in spending and output over the next 12 months. That translates to just over 500,000 full-time jobs at the median wage. And even talking about budgets, this isn't the federal budget, but that money circulates in local economies, and we find that it's just under $2 billion in state and local tax, sales tax revenue that will be generated.
Great. And speaking of sales tax, there was a question in Q&A about this sort of question about tax liability, right? And where we're counting tax liability, income tax liability, sales tax liability. Like, is there something to be commented on here about this reciprocity issue that you all talked about, and kind of thinking about that everybody usually pays taxes, right? But how do we think about which type of tax is being credited on this one? And have you guys given any thought to kind of the messaging or framing around that particular issue?
I think the commenter is right that a lot of these low-income families, even if they're not, we've made a choice mostly in the tax code to not be taxing people into or deeper into poverty. So a lot of these low-income families are not paying federal income tax, but do pay significant other types of federal taxes and also their state and local taxes. But I wouldn't have that drive actual policy design, in part for one of the reasons that Sam mentioned, which is I think that when we think about whether or not a family is a taxpayer, even if we're concerned about that sort of fairly narrow, determination of how they interact with society, the social compact, even if we were focused on that, people come in and out of that status over time. people's incomes can be quite volatile. They can have spells out to, as Sam was mentioning, give birth to a child or take care of an elderly parent or do some other type of thing that's outside the labor force and then come back in. So I think taking sort of 1 year snapshots, which is again one of the things that, you know, the reality of any tax or benefit system sort of really does have to do, sort of determine whether we're doing it monthly or yearly or some other period. It doesn't sort of neatly line up with a policy design that you can get traction on.
Other comments before I jump to the next one?
Yeah, you know, the U.S., you know, Bernie Sanders notwithstanding, has a very progressive income tax code. You know, it's not just that there are a lot of non-filers. It's, you know, this year, something like nearly 60% of Americans will not have to owe federal income tax. But nonetheless, they pay state income taxes, they pay payroll taxes, they pay state and local sales taxes, they pay property taxes. And when it comes to, you know, the payroll tax in particular, which has been the Senator Rubio line on this, you know, families will pay into the payroll tax system over the entire life cycle. And I think one of the reasons for not, you know, tightly connecting this to point in time payroll tax liability is that when you're, you know, a 22-year-old single mother, you've maybe just entered the labor market. You're going to be working for many, many years to come. And there's little doubt in my mind that over that entire life cycle, you are going to be a net contributor to the system. The question is, how do we get resources to you when you need them, rather than pairing them with tax liability that will be much higher in your 40s and 50s when your kids are already off to college.
And you're much more likely to be a contributor to the system in the long term if we give you that help when, you know, you have a down year or cyclically, you know, you're not maybe liable for federal income tax in a given year.
And it's important too, from just the reciprocity standpoint, that, you know, the taxes that certainly that Republican senators tend to focus on in terms of being the, you know, threshold for liability that they're going to limit the benefit to. It's, you know, it's the taxes you pay as workers, you know, doing, you know, paid productive work in the formal economy. That is part of the reciprocity. It's not merely that you pay into the system, it's that you do productive work in the formal economy as being a part of the contribution as well. And that's important to stress. And that's, I think, a part of why, you know, a lot of the conservative concerns around work and trying to reinforce work through a family benefit are so salient.
And if I can just add, like, you know, the advanced CTC was also, you know, something that Senator Cassidy proposed as a means to fund paid family leave or paid parental leave. And I think the thinking there has always been that if you offer those benefits, you know, at a time when families need it, that's there. That allows them to stay on in the labor force, that allows them to be contributing members, you know, and then there are economic benefits in the long run, you know. So I do think that this, you know, the advanced CTC is an idea that's sort of popular because of its connection to enabling people to be in the workforce, whether or not, you know, we talk about the particular design of how we're actually administering the benefit.
Great. That gets to another question that's come in about kind of some of the policy goals generally about lifting families above poverty. And we know that that's sometimes for a lot of families, getting over that line is not enough, right? Chaitin, you probably see in Q&A a little bit of the question about this, but talk a little bit about the you know, some of the ways in which policy design might help to encourage work kind of above and beyond kind of a floor, and how you think about this as in combination maybe to Aparna's earlier question about how these fit together with other pieces of the safety net to not mean that we're just looking at kind of jumping over one particular line. Mm-hmm. I'll let you start, checking.
Yeah, look, I think that comment is really on point. The line is something that we take a look at in order to sort of understand the magnitude of what we're doing here, and also the magnitude of the problem in terms of how many families are actually experiencing incomes below one considers like, a poverty threshold. And, lifting, above or below the sort of that particular dollar threshold is not a magical thing. But what we do know is that for the children in those families in particular, preventing long spells for that family below that threshold is associated with a range of harms that are lasting. So for those families that are experiencing it potentially as 1 year or 2 year at a time, which is the vast majority of families in poverty, having that sort of, again, it really is just that safety net for a couple of years can have long-lasting implications for the children and the family in particular. But to also your point, it does have to be, sort of coupled with a range of other investments and policy decisions that are intended to provide people opportunity to have mobility above just that poverty threshold. And those are things that I think, again, sort of the broader package that the CTC is being proposed as part of are intended to really sort of improve the availability of jobs, infrastructure, and other things that really matter for, the ability of families to thrive over the long run, including some, again, some very, very basic types of investments, like ensuring that all children in the US, whether right below or right above the poverty line, have access to clean drinking water that's free of lead. I mean, some of these things are some pretty basic parts of the infrastructure of the economy that are intended to sort of provide those opportunities to move up over time above, significantly above the poverty threshold.
Excellent. Yes. And I think, Wells, you mentioned a few of those other ones on your list, right? Affordable housing, higher paying wages as ones that put together create a package that makes things more affordable and families thriving, not just surviving, right? So one question that also came in, and I see a couple more coming too, are really about the sort of non-filer portal and a lot of struggle about how confusing that might be, given that it's a new way to be engaging a very hard to reach population, as you said, Tom. Any sense, like looking into maybe at least a crystal ball of how the preferred way of thinking about this is, like, should we be really trying to just get more people, even after the 6 months, let's say it's made permanent, just getting them filing their state and local and federal taxes, because that's really a way in which we can bring people into the system? Or how are you thinking about the portal long term as a way to help us with some of that particular population? If you could comment on that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So we've heard the comments on the non-filer portal loud and clear. There are some fundamental issues that make it, clunky to access in some cases, and in some cases, for non-English speakers, it's almost inaccessible without significant help, and that is a problem. The non-filer portal is provided by the IRS Free File Alliance. It's not a government tool. So prospectively, my hope would be that we'd either figure out, a way to make that a much better interface, or, have someone else kind of take that on a more permanent basis. Although I do think, I would point out, 7 million people were able to file through a very similar interface last year, and we've had many more coming in this year. Again, not perfect, but yeah, but I do also think, having a simplified way to file, a quote unquote real tax return when you have, when you actually have a filing obligation, something else that could be useful too, because we know that when people come into the system, there are other benefits, thinking like EITC, for example, that they might be entitled to, that they could very well be missing out on right now. So.
Yeah, and somebody asked an interesting question. I thought a lot about this was when the pandemic first happened, and other countries had sort of an infrastructure to get cash to people pretty quickly. But any lessons you think we're learning here on other hard to reach populations like homeless youth that, you think for long-term sort of policy, either Chai-Ching, I think you talked about other economic shocks and sort of having an infrastructure that's ready, but any other sort of long-term lessons or things you hope we're learning in this 6 months that will kind of translate to, other policies as we move forward? Maybe Sam, I'll see if you have any thoughts on that, and then anybody else want to weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, this goes to one of Wells's points, which is, whether or not this should be the Social Security Administration. If it were, these questions would be much easier to address. You sort of, if we were starting from scratch, you would never make SSI a tax credit, right? And yet, that's essentially what we're doing here, but on a much larger scale. And at least with SSI, although there are many problems with SSI and the Social Security's own ability to administer its programs, they have methods for appointing intermediaries if you don't have a fixed address. If you are homeless, they have ways of setting up a third-party bank account to deposit for you on your behalf. And it's less clear how you do that if this remains a tax credit, because it's connected to you as a worker with a tax liability.
This is one of the things where I think, lawmakers have the pen now, and to the extent that they are making something permanent, they can make decisions about what authorities to give whatever agency, and also the resources, and to even require something that's a simpler portal that is government built or owned in some other way. I know someone also sort of mentioned in the Q&A, is having separate portals confusing? And yes, maybe the answer is that what you want is a sort of a workflow where you get people in and you drop them out as soon as they've filled in what they need to fill in to get what they're eligible for. So the first people that drop out are the non-filers without earnings, then the people that need to actually file for EITC or other benefits that are more complicated, and then the full return folks, all through the same workflow, and it's and completely integrated. But again, I think that's something that lawmakers can decide to require, and if they do require it, also resource the agency or agencies that can build that. The other sort of quick response to your question, Shelley, about sort of learning about the touches with people, and homeless folks and foster youth are also good examples of that. Oftentimes it's actually state agencies rather than a choice between federal agencies in terms of who actually is really in close contact with these harder to reach populations. So I think, again, a really key part of the authorities that we need to be considering when making this program permanent is allowing for there to be sort of robustly designed, privacy conscious, information protective, but having those touches and the ability for information to flow between federal and state agencies to the extent that there is, filer or non-filer sort of consent to that in order to sort of smooth things out.
I think that. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, and not about homeless youth or sort of disconnected filers or non-filers, but one thing we noticed during COVID was the expansion of the state unemployment insurance system to businessmen or gig workers or self-employed people who had traditionally not been able to access UI benefits, right? They were not allowed to access unemployment insurance. And that system opened up, and we saw all of the, huge increase in people claiming the pandemic unemployment assistance. And so just, I think there might be some lessons from there, like what happened there, that all of these people who were originally ineligible for these benefits suddenly came in and were part of the system. And maybe, maybe not all of them did, but we managed to reach a really large population. And there could be learnings from there to, the other programs that we're trying to implement and say, well, what is it that, what incentivized those people to come in, and what's stopping, current non-filers from claiming sort of free cash that we're handing out. So it was just interesting to me how suddenly that program ballooned But when we had to do the stimulus checks, it was so hard to reach certain households, and it was so hard to actually reach people who were not within the tax system. So I don't have any specific lessons, but it does seem like those two, systems operated a little bit differently and created different incentives to get people in.
Yeah, it's the interesting point, I think. Sorry, Chaiting, if you want to jump back in, but I think interesting point that a lot of our social safety net program is administered at the state level, and yet we have these big benefits at the federal tax level. And how do we get those systems to work in more alignment? I think will be an important piece going forward. Wells, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, the experience with I think the non-filer portal, I think it reiterates a point that I opened with, which is I think clarifying the purpose of these family benefits. If the goal is to alleviate poverty, I think it requires a very particular approach, and one that we've been doing for quite a while through the social safety net, which is largely administered at the state level. Whereas if we're trying to reach working families who pay taxes, we would do so through the tax code. And I think part of the difficulty here is that we've both sort of mixed up purposes of these types of benefits, but also the administration, and clarifying those types of purposes, I think should be really the goal, the really sort of higher level and substantive normative goal of the political debate that I think we're going to see over the next few months about trying to make this permanent, is what is the purpose of the benefit and how to structure it accordingly. I've laid out my view that I think this should be for working families, and that we should treat non-working families just in a different way. We should not only administer, but structure the benefit in a different way, because they have all kinds of different needs, and we can't expect to treat and support all families the same way. But clarifying the purposes should, I think, be able to clarify the way we administer the benefit going forward.
So I'm gonna, the last question, I'm gonna, Tom, give you a pass on this, since you probably won't be able to answer it, but different political reasons, different political nuances, and policy nuances aside, anybody want to look in their crystal ball and say that we're looking at some sort of expansion happening in 2022? Anybody want to weigh in? And Aparna, I welcome your thoughts on this too.
I do. I think there's generally a lot of support for the advanced CTC. I think that, as I said, this was not only is the CTC being a policy that has had bipartisan support, the idea of advancing the CTC is something that, a lot of policymakers have agreed upon. As I said, Senator Sinema, Senator Cassidy had agreed to do that for a paid leave bill. Senator Rubio and others have talked about, we need to make benefits, come sooner for families that need it. There's no point in getting a benefit at the end of the year. I do see some aspect of that, continuing into the future, because I think that that's a powerful policy design. We've always sort of struggled to say, how is that ever going to happen? And it's great to see that it can actually happen. In fact, we've talked about it for the EITC as well. The EITC is something that policymakers have said, well, should be available monthly. So I think once we have learnings from this year about how well it reached the people it was intended for, how successfully were there a lot of wrong payments and people were on the hook to send money back. If we see that it was a largely successful pilot, I do see some aspect of that sticking on and perhaps applying to other tax credit programs as well.
Okay, thanks. Other prognosticators?
I already sort of said that I was feeling in an optimistic mood today in response to some other question. I want to carry that on forward. I think it's just a really core part of a package to put in place as part of a recovery package that invests in the long term. And I would hope to see it made permanent or as close to that as it can be. I think there's plenty of revenue raises from sound sources that would help to finance that over the long run. And, look, it's just such a core component of that investment in families piece of this package that I would be astonished if it weren't made permanent or extended for some good number of years.
My feeling on this is that a lot of the skepticism or ambivalence to this expansion will dissipate over the coming years if it is extended, especially as you start to see these sort of second order, third order effects on local economies. And for that reason, I think it's really essential that this be, if we can't get to permanence, that at least be extended to 2025, so that that learning can take place. And to the extent that this is where it sits in the hierarchy of priorities, there's a lot of talk about whether the Biden administration is FDR-like, LBJ-like. If we look back on FDR and the New Deal, one of the things that stuck around was Social Security, right? That's what people really remember, and this could be a defining legacy of this administration. And right now, I think it will happen. But if there's any threat, it's going to come from the left, ironically, because they're trying to have everything in the kitchen sink into this one massive bill.
Okay, thanks. Wells, you get the last word, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I think that both Aparna and Sam are right that sort of from the learnings this past year, I think we're likely to see it be a very popular program. I think we'll definitely see at least some kind of extension. I think the question will be, of course, how it's administered and structured. And then I think the big sort of question for me is if we see some kind of consensus on the right of center. Of course, Lee and Rubio faced tremendous institutional headwinds in 2017 and tax reform, just trying to expand the CTC then. But I was encouraged in their amendment back to the American Rescue Plan that received no Republican no votes. So we may be able to see some kind of consensus emerge. I suspect it'll be around the Rubio-Lee plan, but I'm encouraged that seeing these monthly payments go out and see the economic impacts, we may begin to sort of frame the debate instead around reciprocity and work.
Awesome. Well, we are over time. I just want to say thank you for this amazing and deep and rich policy discussion. The event recording will be posted on both the Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity and the American Academies of Political and Social Science website, so you can look for that in case your friends and family missed it. And I just want to say thank you again. And it is very encouraging to be thinking about this level of exciting policy for kids and families and to do it with all of you. So thanks again, and we'll see you on a future event. Take care, everyone.